goes. All righty. Well, hello, everyone. Welcome to another edition of One Plus One, your place for inconvenient truth telling and myth busting. And on this episode, we return to the country of Mexico. So it's our All Things Latin America edition. And we welcome back to the show Jay Watts. Jay Watts, who is a photojournalist, former central organizer of the Communist Party of Canada. He still is a communist, though, and a big leftist activist at that. And I consider him a historian, media, and NGO critic. And he is a member of Mexico Solidarity. And he comes to us from Mexico City. So let's get underway. So, first off, Jay, welcome back to the show.
Thanks. Happy to be here and talk about the judicial reform and maybe mention a bit of some of the other reforms too, because that one has got a lot of attention, but there's also some other important ones that I think are deserved of attention for anybody on the left.
Oh, definitely, and it's a real honor to get the chance to speak to you. And actually, yes, I actually just say, just before I get to the first question, that I find it amazing that AMLO, he's an outgoing president now, and yet he can still do a lot of he can still pass a lot of very good, interesting legislation, and of course, and of course, it still is astonishing that his that it's still it still is astonishing that a lot of left-leaning media is not focusing on what's happening in Mexico when there's lots of positive things going on in Mexico. And the interesting thing I find about AMLO, we talked about this last time, and I talked
Mhm.
about this with another Mexican leftist who was on the show, Gabrielle, was the expat community of Venezuela, for example. Often when I'm sure you've had this experience. A lot of like the expats you meet from like Venezuela are all very hostile towards Maduro and Chavez before. And of course, they either come from a very affluent middle class background or just a super rich background. Even Bolivia, the few Bolivians I've met who live outside of Bolivia, very hostile towards Morales and the current president. But Mexico with AMLO, a lot of the Mexican expat communities and those who live like in the United States and who are either legal immigrants there or illegal immigrants, AMLO is very popular. So again, it's just incredible how criminally overlooked Mexico has been. Your thoughts on that before we talk about the judicial reforms?
Yeah, I think that's definitely the case that that sort of like within left media, although it's changed a little bit recently with Claudia Sheinbaum being elected, that but certainly over the 6 years of AMLO, there's been very little. I think maybe some of the more substantial work that might be looked at like that I think is worthwhile looking at rather is Edwin Ackerman in the New Left Review. I was saying the New Left Review I tend to find like sometimes reads like I don't know, intelligence reports from a CIA agent about left governments. It's very, very strange. And I also like don't entirely agree with everything he has to say, but I think it is still that's one of the exceptions, maybe. And of course, Kurt Hackbarth, who writes in Jacobin and who I work with at Mexico Solidarity. Solidarity Reddit. He lives here in Oaxaca and he's writes about Mexico. But outside of that, there's not really much in sort of the Anglo-American media. I think the DSA International Committee, which tends to be more on the left of the DSA, and has had some issues with the NPC recently, has been paying more attention. They were down here to observe the elections and that, but still, I think there's a lot missing. And I'm glad that we're concentrating specifically on the judicial reform because I was actually thinking about how it's portrayed in the media, how the left is looking at it, and something that I don't think is talked about very much, and probably because Morena and AMLO don't necessarily want to talk about, but we can get into it a bit later. But my basic idea is I think that there is a substantial political purge going on, which I agree with, of a corrupt judiciary, which is connected to local and international capital. and to old neoliberal political parties. And there's a significant amount of the civil service that is going to be, their jobs are going to be on the line. I mean, these new elections that are coming up with judges and stuff, they'll be able to run again. But there's also going to be an opportunity for Mexicans to look at their record and say, do we like these people or not? And so, in a way, that's something that people in Morena aren't really mentioning. Everybody knows that this is because of corruption, but it's also a very radical thing. I mean, this is something that has been done after like actual revolutions, with armed violence and things like that, and real transitions to socialism or something like that. So this is something like this is actually pretty unprecedented. Like, and you can see how much how much liberalism people have absorbed because of this idea that quote unquote independent judiciary, which there's I don't think that exists, but that is that
Exactly.
sort of idea, that liberal idea is a very common amongst left-wing people, and especially amongst left-wing people who are maybe even looking down here with a little bit of concern. And that idea that anything from the state can be quote unquote independent is a little ridiculous too.
Exactly. And when we talk about judiciaries, you can be an elected leftist with a with with a majority, in your parliament or in your Congress. And yeah, you could probably get some important legislation passed, but there's often an oligarchic high courts and judiciary, which will often basically, uh, okay, I'm gonna say an inappropriate word, so apologies for that. But they'll cock block, some important things, and Argentina is a very good example of that. It's
Yeah.
very because and Argentina is very similar to a lot of, if you want to call them liberal democracies, yeah, you can call them liberal democracies like in Spain, Belgium, and so forth. And the right wing and the right has a lot of power in the judiciary in Argentina, which was why it took so long to get so many of those like fascists to actually be put on trial and
Mhm.
and go to jail. Brazil has that huge problem, and Lula doesn't even, and Lula and both Lula and Delma never had a majority in their Congress and stuff like that, which is why I think it's very interesting what AMLO is doing. And just bizarre once again how when you watch like Western corporate state media, it could be France 24, it could be DW, Germany, and even like Spanish media that's coming out of like Spain, how they're depicting this as like AMLO being a dictator, and that AMLO's going to actually be empowering corruption. So
I mean,
so so
yeah,
first,
that's
yeah,
oh
go ahead.
sorry. First I'll think I'll take Yeah, I mean, it's the idea that somehow the Mexican judiciary as it stands right now is free of corruption is like, and independence somehow is so bizarre. Nobody believes that. Nobody would ever believe that, and certainly nobody believed that before the sort of like corporate media attack on this. Which is why this reform is incredibly popular amongst people who are in the opposition. It's popular everywhere in Mexico. There's local business associations who are definitely to the right of anywhere Morena is and who approve of it, and that's also a fundamental thing which is not really talked about. I've been going through the sort of critical corporate media from the United States and Canada and Europe, going through it and seeing what they're actually saying about it. Sometimes they'll accurately represent what's going to happen. A lot of times they're very vague about why this is to be opposed. And it's, well, okay, it's just the principle of an independent judiciary. And then it's investor uncertainty. What does that specifically mean in the context of Mexico? I think what it means is that these people have been bribing judges for decades, at least since the 90s, probably even longer than that. I know Canadian mining companies love it, to get injunctions to let their projects go through, or to stop the actual laws of the land in terms of environmental laws, labor laws, be forced upon them. There's a thing in Mexico called amparos, which are basically injunctions, which sound amazing in principle, that a court can intercede to protect the rights of a person, of an individual, an economically disadvantaged or marginalized person from having their rights overturned. It's never really been used like that. It's primarily been used to protect the property rights, which don't actually really exist in the Mexican Constitution, but are sort of de facto, or rather ad hoc, decided by the judiciary that's currently there. That, okay, we can continue mining, we can continue dumping garbage in the rivers and streams and things like that. Or it's a violation of their privacy rights that we're gonna look into their tax evasion, like stuff like that. It's just so incredibly common. And that's really when they talk about investor uncertainty, the fact is that now they're like, okay, we were bribing these judges for decades. We know how to like get our way with them. Now there might be elected judges and we don't know if we can bribe them. That's really what they're saying. And they'll talk about USMCA, the formerly known as NAFTA, because that they want a supra legal structure that exists above the Mexican Constitution, that exists above Mexican laws, that forces Mexico to do what they want.
Yeah,
And that's what they're worried about, is not that the rule of law is going to be overturned, but that the rule of law and the Mexican Constitution, which despite all the fuckery of previous neoliberal governments, still maintains a very strong, like, progressive core, is going to come into a place. And you're going back to like to this lawfare thing too. This is
exactly.
what's happened in
Lawfare.
Ecuador. It's happened in all across Latin America. Is that when left-wing governments come into power, and even with massive amounts of majority and political power, the judiciary stands in their way. And how does it do it? Why does it do it? Well, yes, it represents oligarchic interests, but like in many other countries in Latin America, in Mexico, a lot of lawyers who work here have training from the American Bar Association. Or they even went to school in the States. The United States has spent a lot of money trying to, without also trying to change the Constitution, but even without it, to create a core of the judiciary of lawyers who have a liberal democratic idea of the law. And that I mean liberal democratic, not in the sense of individual rights, political rights, but the actual core of liberal democracy, which is that private property rights are what guarantee the rights of everything else. That's Mexico doesn't have that.
Exactly.
Sorry, Mexico had a revolution, and Mexico has a constitution which, as much as it's been fucked with, as I said before, still is not a liberal democratic constitution. Mexico is fundamentally, but not all the time, like a popular democracy. Now that doesn't there's problems with that, and it's not socialism or anything like that, but it's certainly something a lot better than a bourgeois liberal democracy, as much as it has elements of that. And so this reform is very substantial because it gives a chance for a purge, but also a chance, like, if Mexicans decide they like these judges and they like what they're deciding, they can elect them. Same with the Supreme Court. This is going to happen over a 2-year kind of period or whatever. So it's not they're not all being, sent out to the gulag or something like that. But they're having a substantial review. And in a country that has so much issues with corruption, with organized crime, violence, and within the judiciary, with corporate tax evasion, all of that sort of stuff, this is a really smart way to sort of take that head on. Also, because it's like, if you try to initiate a piecemeal corruption going through, you're dealing with so many people, so much stuff. There's so many possibilities for bribery, for violence, that just to like sort of like, oh well, we'll do a review and look at everything. I think you need something this drastic and this substantial. And to go back to like there are plenty of reforms. There are plenty of things that Mexicans really wanted that the Supreme Court shot down on incredibly spurious reasons. Not on, oh, this violates the Constitution, but no, this wasn't filed at the right time. This or here, just bullshit reasons. One of the big examples 2 years ago, before I lived here in the spring, there was a proposal for an energy reform. So one of the things that happens here during the neoliberal period is that corporations, large corporations like OXXO, like 7-Eleven, these corner stores receive subsidized electricity. So that means even in terms of, a corner store that's owned by a Mexican, they don't receive that. So their overhead is very substantial. That's why there's OXXOs and 7-Elevens on every fucking corner in Mexico, is because they receive this massive, gigantic subsidy, whereas even smaller Mexican businesses don't receive it. So obviously, Mexicans wanted this reform to go through. They pushed for it. It did not go through. There's many, many other cases. The Economist even pointed out that the AMLO's government during his 6-year period had the most sort of laws knocked down by the Supreme Court. And like, why is the Supreme Court doing this? Because AMLO doesn't have a popular mandate? Doesn't? No, of course he did. Of course, this is what people voted for. That's what they wanted. And that was substantially, AMLO, I think, also showed, and this is something that's missing from a lot of the left abroad, I would say, especially the social democratic left in the United States, Canada, and Europe, is that he fought these things and showed that, look, the issue here is the Supreme Court is stopping us. So what was voted for under Claudia Sheinbaum, the super majority that they have in the Chamber of Deputies and in the Senate, was called Plan C. Was, we tried Plan A, we tried to get it through. We tried Plan B. Now we're doing Plan C. People voted knowing that this was coming. So this is overwhelmingly the will of the people, this judicial reform, and plenty of the other reforms that are on the docket right now, that are passing this week, actually.
Unbelievable. Well, you actually already sort of answered my first question, but let me just ask it again, which is, which is actually talk a bit more to our audience about this big judicial reform that the outgoing president of Mexico, AMLO, who is a social democratic reformer, and yes, he's done lots of major reforms and some super gains for the majority Mexican working class slash working poor people and the precarious middle class. He's leaving with a higher. I know for a fact that he is leaving with a higher approval rating than any president before him. So he still has a mandate to do major policies, and he began this judicial reform. Talk to us a bit more about that. And now I'm not surprised that it got opposition, but I was stunned at how violent the protests were. So can you talk to us about that and why it was met with such aggressive protests?
So I would say, I think the scale of the protests is being overestimated by the media, but not
Okay.
necessarily the violence.
Okay.
So there's a lot larger protests. I mean, they had one of them with the opposition at the Angel of Independence. It was like 1,000 people at the most or something. That is in a place where even the opposition before last year was getting 200,000 people out or something like that. This is not substantial. I think the judiciary strike was big. That is the workers deciding that they wanted to leave, and they know that I mean, this is a lot of people's livelihoods on the line. There's a lot of people. They did some estimate, and which I think is even under, which is like 40% of the judges have family members working in the judiciary. Like, there's a big network. There's networks of families and people involved in this. And so obviously those people, when they see their livelihoods are at stake, and people probably don't like their jobs and they're going to lose them if they are being reviewed, are going to be very angry and very upset. But I think you are pointing out an important thing, which is, why are these so violent? Why has this violence happened? There was a certain amount of political violence within the elections, which again, the corporate media made it seem like was Morena targeting people, but no, it was even kind of almost evenly divided, maybe even a little bit more, that there was like Morena people murdered, right? So there's
So kind of
a right wing. Yeah.
kind of like sorry to interrupt, but kind of like how Nicaragua, there was an important social security pension reform that needed to be done, but it was depicted in the NGO world and in Western corporate media and Spanish corporate media, whether it's in Spain or the U.S. with the corrupt Univision, as Daniel Ortega is being a dictator and he's suppressing protesters when it was the complete opposite if you were an independent unembedded journalist. And actually no, like, it was a right-wing opposition astroturfed by Western opposition to Daniel Ortega because he's a goddamn socialist.
Yeah, well, I mean that's part of it. Like recently, about a month ago, maybe 3 weeks ago, AMLO sent a letter to Biden saying, okay, like stop funding. You're funding these right-wing opposition groups. Please stop funding it. And then Ken Salazar, the ambassador here, who had initially said he was fine with the reform, the judicial reform, because in his home state they elect judges. So okay, that sounds good. Then turned against it, started getting involved, and the Canadian ambassador, I forget his name, but it's really irrelevant. Like whatever, he's
Exactly.
mining. He speaks for mining companies and listens to the United States. Also said something similar. So AMLO paused relations with the two embassies. But I think what has happened, and I'd like to direct people to Soberanía, this podcast, their most recent issue. It's Mexico Solidarity. It's Jose Luis Granado Ceja and Kurt Hackbarth. They speak specifically about the violence that the right wing has been engaged in. And I think part of that is because they've seen politically and electorally they can't win. That in the Senate, in the Chamber of Deputies, they can't win there. Probably with the courts, they can't win. They're becoming radicalized, and they also know and feel that the United States and other countries will stand behind them. So, in this past week, we've obviously had the protests in the Senate. I mean, they broke into the Senate. They broke down the doors. They were doing stuff like. The thing about Mexico, and I have to say, is that I've been to protests here, even more ones for the ultra left. The police here are very mild compared to what if similar things happen in
Militarized police
Canada
of the
or the
United
United
States and
States.
Canada.
Yeah, people would be dead. People would be shot. I'm not saying that the police everywhere in Mexico are great, but at least in many cases when it comes to political protests, there's a lot of leeway, and especially the Senate. I mean, no, you would be shot if in Canada if you tried to break into the Senate. So there was that violence. Noronha, who is the more left leaning, he was in the Workers' Party. Now he's in Morena, and he's the president of the Senate. Very popular socialist. He was attacked at an airport by one of these lawyers, a corporate lawyer who specializes in tax evasion. Attacked him, took his phone. A couple days ago as well, somebody threw a bottle at AMLO and yelled at him. One of the judiciary workers. Nothing happened to this person. So what Jose Luis and Kurt think, and I would agree too, is that there's a radicalization of, well, okay, the views of the right wing here are radical already, but there's a radicalization of their tactics and their because they know that they can't win, and they also know that uh they kind of win either way, right? Either Morena, AMLO, the government does nothing. They're allowed to go further and further, or they do something and they can portray themselves as victims of political persecution, right? Like, which is what happened in Nicaragua. Nicaragua had in 2018 went to insane more violence than is happening in Mexico right now, sort of like Gurimba, Venezuela type stuff. And of course, the government cracked down. But now the whole narrative, which before 2018 was not the narrative at all, by the way, before 2018, people thought of Nicaragua, rightfully as it is, a very peaceful place in a very non-peaceful area without any issues of drugs and violence and things like that plague El Salvador, Guatemala, Honduras. So that's seems to be what they're going at now. There is also an ultra right here under Verestigue, who wanted to be a candidate. He's in that what's that movie called? Oh, Cries of Freedom or something. There's some ultra right wing like QAnon movie that he was a star on about sexual trafficking of children or something like that. Anyways, he didn't even get enough signatures to become a candidate. But I think that's also because the ultra right knows there's still a place with them within the sort of moderate right. But there's the CPAC conference here that tries to bring in Malay and other people, Zionists and groups like that. So and the moderate right wing here, moderate right wing, electoral right wing, is connected to Vox Party in Spain. There's a lot of ultra right connections. So I think it's this is a different situation too, right? And this is also why the judicial reform is it's a perfect time for it, is because the United States in its relationship with China is changing. And so nearshoring is very important. And so they need what Mexico has, which is workers, infrastructure, proximity to the United States to provide for their market. What's happening right now is Mexico is also using that, as China did, which is, yes, exploiting the wages of their workers, but to develop a market here, which hopefully the timing is good while the United States sort of is on the down, is declining, that Mexico will have a different market. I would hope that this also means that Mexico is going to turn towards more Latin American integration, because I think that we've seen from the USMCA and NAFTA that the United States and Canada are not good partners. 2026 USMCA is coming up for a review. A lot of people in the business sectors in the US and Canada think it'll be more of a renegotiation, which I think will be good for Mexico, whether it's a Democrat or a Republican.
Or a
Although
liberal or a
honestly,
conservative in Canada.
or a conservative again. Well, I think Canada doesn't really matter. They'll follow whatever the United States has to do. I mean, it's funny too, because there's a lot that even the business community in Canada could learn about how Mexico is dealing with. Mexico is not following the anti-China model of what is being imposed on Canada by the United States. They're not doing it, and it's to the benefit of Mexico and Mexicans.
Now, who are some of the other actors behind the protests? And of course, stupid question is, the U.S. and Canada were they definitely involved? Because I know uh, you mentioned that the one American senator and the one American ambassador expressing concerns, and of course
Mhm.
Justin Trudeau and his dingbats parents were also saying we're very concerned about what's happening in Mexico. So who else was behind these protests, and were they astroturf? Because this is not the first time though that Mexico under AMLO has had to face these kinds of grotesque right wing goons. The Gray Zone, back when I used to read the Gray Zone, and when Ben Norton was
Yeah.
part of the team, did a huge report on that. And of course, I'm curious where everyone's favorite tall mustachio right wing dingbat, the Vicente Fox, has he also been involved in these in these protests?
I
Saying that
he's
because I know he's never going to pay for the fucking wall, but he also doesn't want to pay for this fucking judicial reform.
Not so much. I mean, I would think there is organic opposition to it. Organic in the sense that it comes from corrupt judiciary workers who are very scared of what might happen to their jobs. So I don't think you could say it's entirely astroturf, but I can say you can see some of the videos on TikTok or even on Twitter of what happened in the Senate. There was this one guy who's like, sometimes I think this is overstated, but obviously like fucked up on something, who probably had was some lumpen kid who was bought to be there, who, after they had broken into the Senate, he's sort of like fucked up, and he's sitting at one of the seats of the senators. They've obviously vacated the chamber. And there's the chemicals from the fire extinguisher that are down there, which also they said they tear gas people. No, they themselves set off the fire extinguishers. Anyways, he starts like eating the fire extinguisher like stuff, the chemicals, and then like whatever 5 to 10 minutes later is all fucked up and passing out. So the right wing used that video of him fucked up and passing out, being like, "Look at they beat him up so bad." It's like, no, this guy like was like poisoning himself to make it look like that. But there are certain groups, and this gets to like why AMLO wrote that letter to Biden, which the USAID and National Endowment for Democracy fund up to millions of dollars groups like Mexicans Against Corruption and Impunity. It's run by this woman who, funnily enough, her uh, quite a while ago, her husband had just started working at Pemex and had died, and she, because it was there was a suspicious circumstance. Anyway, she basically fraudulently has this gigantic pension from it, from her ex-husband working there for one week before he committed suicide or was thrown out of the top window. And she's the head of this, like supremely corrupt woman is the head of Mexicans Against Corruption and Impunity. There's lots of these groups, tons of them. You look at when in the past, when the opposition has organized these gigantic civil society marches where they don't want to be seen as part of the PAN or PRI, and that's because these parties are considered incredibly corrupt and horrible. So they have all these civil society front organizations. They're basically all funded by Mexican business interests, but primarily USAID and National Endowment for Democracy. So yes, they're all involved. They fund journalistic outfits, et cetera, et cetera. And then, of course, there are tax scofflaws like Carlos Salinas Priego, who owes something like $2 to $3 billion US in back taxes. It was revealed before a Supreme Court justice was appointed, revealed this week. They tried to bribe her so that she would vote, to not have him pay taxes. So there's a whole grouping of people who do not represent rank and file or working class Mexicans, or which a majority of Mexicans are working class and poor, don't represent them at all, that are connected to business interests and also to foreign governments. Yeah.
But luckily, this there's a happy ending to this story, which is the judicial reform got passed. So
Yeah.
uh so so uh yeah, what does that entail then? Like how is that going to have a very positive long-term
Yeah.
effect on Mexican day-to-day state of affairs?
Okay, so essentially all judges everywhere at every level, including the Supreme Court, will now be elected. Previously, and this is a thing too, is that the criticism of this is that it's anti-democratic, that people will elect their judges, but the previous model where they're appointed, also AMLO, if he wanted, could get rid of the Supreme Court as Zedillo, a former president, did entirely, and replace it with whoever he wants. So somehow this is going to be less democratic. It doesn't really make sense. But it's about 7,000 judges that will be voted on. That doesn't mean that every Mexican votes for 7,000 judges, but I've heard a lot of concerns too, where people are like, because in the States they do have elected judges, not always the best situation. I think there's issues that can come from it, but I think one of the things that prevents that is that in Mexico there isn't private financing of elections. There's a lot of public financing for elections. Sometimes that's bad too, but that means that they're not going to be out there having donors behind you and stuff. So the first election is going to happen June 1st, 2025. The rest will be 2026 to 2027. Basically, there are evaluation committees within the executive, legislative, judicial branches that are going to determine who's able to run. No political parties, right? You can't be like, I'm a Morena member, I'm running. For everything below the Supreme Court, you have to have a law degree, at least 5 years experience practicing in law, a certain level of grades within law school, and letters of recommendation. But you also need 5 letters of recommendation from your neighbors or colleagues or other people. So Cuba has a very similar model for how they elect their legislator, which is that it's not political parties, it's people in their neighborhoods, et cetera, et cetera. Candidates also submit an essay of 3 pages or so. So that's kind of the limit of their campaigning, right? So it's a very different thing than buying billboards and doing all that sort of stuff, which does happen in obviously the other levels of government. At the
Fascinating.
Supreme Court, the experience will be a law degree and 10 years of experience, so a little bit more. They're reducing the Supreme Court from 11 to 9 justices, and all their meetings will have to be public. The terms that they
Wow.
have, yeah,
That's incredible. Wow.
they're getting rid of their retirement pensions, and there'll be 12-year terms, not 15. So in the United States Supreme Court, which is, I mean, this is also, anybody who follows anything knows the United States Supreme Court is fucking ridiculous. Uh,
Exactly.
who are, they're justices for life, right? And in Canada, even now it's 75. You retire at 75, you can be removed, but it's very rare. Two of the things that I think are very important are that there's basically getting rid of the Federal Judiciary Council and replacing it with two things: a judicial administrative body. It's a 5-person council that the president adopts, sort of oversees administration, a bureaucracy, basically. The second thing, which is very important, and I think is going to go looking into the review of what judges in the past have done, is the Court of Judicial Discipline. Now, those are 5 elected members who are elected to a 6-year term. So to investigate and discipline public servants within the judiciary. So, and that includes the Supreme Court. So that, I think that's, if I had to guess what that'll be used for immediately, it's going to be to look at what's happened in the last years that these judges were around. And then another thing that's also very important, and technically is that judiciary members will not be able to make more than the president. That's supposed to be already. Every civil servant can't make more than it. They reduced the Supreme Court salaries right now. Let me find this too, because I think it's really instructive to
Yeah, yeah,
see
sure. Yeah, yeah.
what
Go right ahead.
what they are. So currently, actually before the most recent, basically Supreme Court judges were making $22,000 to $23,000 a month US. And so that's a country where the minimum wage is $386, right? Like that might not seem much in the United States, $23,000 a month for a Supreme Court judge, but in Mexico, that is incredible. Now it's been reduced to about 10,000 or 11,000 US monthly. Still a very, very, very high amount, but it'll be
And this is
capped
and this
at,
sorry to interrupt, but this is why so many people from a working class background hates what they call the bourgeoisie.
yeah, yeah,
And also
yeah.
why
I
so
mean,
many, rich douchebags and very insincere bourgeois, affluent middle class people get into law.
well, and the other thing too is that and this is kind of happens in the private sector, but it's very prominent in the public sector in Mexico, is that they have these trusts, they receive doctors, free food, drivers, all of these other benefits that amount to like substantial, like sort of knock up their salary, houses, things like that. So they're very, very, very rich people, and that's what AMLO has always said. It's you can't have a rich government and a poor people, and so this is part of like turning that back. So just even outside of the corruption, the savings are very substantial for people. So that's basically it, is that there'll be elected judges at this level,
Fascinating.
and and people will be able to vote for them. So the current judges who are there, they'll be able to run again. It's not that everybody's been put in prison, but they might have to run again with people aware of their record and what they've done and how they've helped benefit corporate power here from capital from Mexico and capital from abroad, or criminals as well.
Yeah, you know what I always find funny about the rich and the powerful and the affluent bourgeoisie and so forth, and this is also the same thing with the whole stand with Ukraine crowd and people and Israel and Israel's lawyers, many of them unpaid, Zionists. Is so if you look at say the stand with Ukraine crowd, they have all the media, all the corporate media, all the state media, and all the celebrities and so forth you can imagine that say, stand with Ukraine, Russia is a Nazi state, blah, 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 and so forth. And yet they still feel the need when you're somebody like Dimitri Lascaris and you want to do a speaking tour to explain how we stopped the war in Ukraine, and they come out in droves and very angry, how dare you, and like protest. same with like Israel. Like Israel is backed by all of the most powerful Western states, and yet, if you talk to right wing Israelis or other patriotic Israelis, they still act as if they're the victim and the whole world is like anti-Semitic and stuff like that.
Yeah.
And that's
I
like
mean, it does
and
get
and and
down to
and
like,
and and, and, and the reason why I compare this to Mexico and the people who are hostile to these radical democratic reforms is like, dude, like these are the rich. Like they still have their thousands of like corporate run newspapers. They still have access to corporate media, state media, even, and they still have their entire network, and they still have like all the money in the world to propagate people to vote for them. And so yeah, so it's as Bob Marley says, they always want more.
I
Your
think,
response.
that's actually something interesting. There's a journalist here, Sabina Burman, who's on the left but comes from sort of like a very, very rich family. And she said something. She's familiar with the sort of the ruling class in Mexico. She said, I don't know if this is true, but I'm gonna think it is. Everything indicates it is, or maybe the numbers aren't exactly correct. But she says, in more advanced global north democracies, even under monopoly capitalism, there you have something like 30% of the money that comes in from a major corporation will go to shareholders. It's profit, right? 70% is wages, fixed capital costs, and something like that. In Mexico, it's reversed. It's super, like the super profits here, that 70% is profit. That is like an incredible amount of money. And you also have the fact that a lot of these corporations that haven't, in the previous administration, never even pay taxes. That is, that there's significant amounts of profit being made here. This is another thing too, right? Why there's this room for judicial reform, for things to happen, is that corporate, what are they going to go to Dominican Republic, to Panama, to something like that? Like, the corporations can't, the benefits are so good right now. And I think that's what Morena is counting on. So I hope, however, that there's going to be the ability to use that, but to deepen the transformation, to actually deal with the problems, which is super profits here eventually. But I think that the path that they're going through is sort of like an industrialization, Keynesian sort of approach, creating a market here, something that was supposedly supposed to be done in NAFTA, never really happened. Um, but you're right, like rich people here, even like, are incredibly rich, incredibly rich. They really, but that's the thing, is rich people don't want to lose anything. They don't want to lose any power. They don't lose shit. So even small, moderate things, just being, first of all, it was AMLO speaks differently than us, and he's kind of insulting to us. So we hate him. Let's overthrow him. Now, obviously, it's more substantial. So I don't think the right wing is going to have any more sense. I think they're going to get more radical and more upset. And I think that also at some point the more underlying contradictions of capitalism will have to be dealt with in Mexico. I think there's a lot of capacity now because of the corruption, because of the fact that you just have to tax people, and there's a lot more money to hang around because Mexico is very rich in sort of wealth and natural resources as well too. But yeah, you're right. Like they can't handle anything, and they have all of the power, but any small amount of it like turns them fucking livid. And I mean, that's the thing too. That's why revolutions happen, right? Like
And
socialists
that's
don't
all.
necessarily want
But also,
violence and stuff like that, but the fact is that people who live off of other people and have for centuries are will never give that away voluntarily. So at some point, it comes to a head.
exactly. And I got two more questions for you. I don't know if we had the chance to talk about this during our very epic conversation about Mexican history and so forth, but because of AMLO's very positive policies, which benefit mostly the working class, and of course, the unemployed, because AMLO's policies have helped out the majority working class in Mexico. Has there been a decrease, like a very dramatic decrease of illegal migration over to the United States. Because as you mentioned to me and as Gabrielle mentioned to me, AMLO was very popular amongst the Mexican diaspora in the U.S. Those from those from a poor legal immigrant background and those from a poor illegal background.
Yeah, there has been. I don't know if it's for this year, if it's the same, but I know last year, either the year previous, there was actually a reversal. Like there was more people coming back to Mexico than there were going in. So a lot of what's happening with the border right now is people from Cuba, from Venezuela, people from Nicaragua, people that the United States El Salvador, people in the United States is sanctioning, or their proxies are kind of fucking with Ecuador, for example, that are coming through Mexico and going into the United States. So I don't know if that number is still the same. I don't know if, but I would assume so. I think that the like another thing that he's also doing that well, I guess actually that Claudia Sheinbaum will be doing is right now there are stipends and pensions for like top ups basically for senior citizens, and those are only available to Mexicans in in Mexico. But he's proposed that Claudia Sheinbaum will expand it to have Mexicans abroad, which is really interesting. So, because there's a lot of remittance. Like, why did people go to the United States? Not because they fucking love Trump or they love Harris or love Obama or love Biden. It's because they want to work and they want to make money. And generally, they try to be there and send as much money to their family's home so they can build up something here and then leave. Like people, I mean, obviously there are people who want to live in the United States, but I don't think that's the majority of people who especially cross illegally. But so it's funny. So now actually money from Mexico will be going to Mexicans in the United States rather than always being remittances coming from Mexicans and then coming here then. So that's interesting. But
That
yeah, I don't know
that's
the actual
fascinating.
numbers, but definitely irregular migration to the United States is not a Mexican citizens. It's other people from primarily Latin American countries.
I find that so fascinating because because another fascinating thing I've noticed uh, I actually met a Mexican when I was flying back to Belgium. I got the chance to spend time in Scotland and North England, and I was flying back to Belgium, and I spent time talking to this Mexican that was actually traveling to Belgium to go to Tomorrowland. So we were talking a little bit about Mexican politics and in the U.S. and so forth, and he was very positive about AMLO, and I was asking him, how are the the Mexicans, Mexican Americans, and so forth, and in the U.S. How are they feeling about AMLO? And a lot of them, and he said that a lot of them are also are very positive towards AMLO, and he said a very interesting thing. He says that if you go to lots of parts of the U.S. where there's a big like Mexican American majority community, he says that a lot of them actually don't even speak English. So there's no longer really like a big like Chicano population. And I think and again I find that interesting because that means that these people who are subjected to propaganda from Univision, Jorge Ramos, and so forth aren't believing the negative stories that Univision and so forth are saying about AMLO, because apparently like Jorge Ramos is very hostile towards AMLO. And I'm curious your response on that before I get to the last question.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know enough about those communities. I mean, obviously, there's a large chunk of the United States that was once Mexico, and so there's there's also that Chicano population, right, which was Mexican at one time, is no longer. Um, but in terms of the diaspora, I mean, I know Noronha is who I mentioned before, the more lefty guy, and who kind of came in either second or third, depending who you say, and probably will be running in 2030 as the head of the Senate. He's very popular in amongst the diaspora in the United States. Um, but I think yeah, I mean, to me, Univision has more of like a Miami feel than a than a Chicano feel necessarily. And but I also think that, like, right, like if you've gone to the United States, whether covertly or not, you're there because you're sending money back and you're talking to your family, and probably at a certain point your family has received benefit. If you're in that situation, your family's definitely received benefits from AMLO's 6-year term, from Morena being in power, right? So you would notice that, oh, my grandmother or my mother now, like, has 2,000, 3,000, 5,000 extra pesos a month. Like, she's able to go out and stuff, or she can, get food or shop at the one of the subsidized state groceries or things like that. So I'm sure that people recognize that lives in Mexico are better. And it was released recently, it was updated. I think the amount is, it's either 6.1 or 7 million people have been lifted out of extreme poverty up until this year. That's a lot. That's a lot of people. That's a lot of people whose lives are better. And also that means that money goes into the economy. We're basically a full employment economy. Of course, there's a big informal sector, but that means that there's a domestic market. Businesses do better because people have more money in their pockets, et cetera. It's just that basic sort of Keynesian thing that's happening here is happening. And so I'm sure that people in the United States from Mexican families are aware of that and seeing it, and know that the stuff that Univision cares about or pretends it cares about is doesn't reflect their lives. I don't think many people who are in that situation are looking at the judicial reform and being like, "Oh, please don't touch the beloved judges of Mexico. So wonderful. They've treated us so well, and this dictator is fucking with them." No, no, let them. I don't think anyone's saying that. Not
Right.
seriously.
Well, in the future, we're going to have, and in the future, which is always the plan. I'll have you and hopefully another member of Mexico Solidarity to come back on to assess Claudia Scheinbaum's first 100 days. But the last question I want to ask you, because we've been talking about judicial reforms and the rabid reactionary far right and so forth, I've not had the chance to cover Brazil since Bolsonaro's cult followers tried to do a January 6th storming of the barricades. So I know you follow well. You follow international affairs in general, but I wanted to ask you: do you know what's going on in Brazil in terms of like the Brazilian judiciary prosecuting these like far right douchebags that try to overturn the elections? And yeah, I'm curious your response on that.
No, I haven't followed. I was in Brazil. I went to Sao Paulo last year in January of last year. But I really haven't been kept up haven't kept up too much with politics. I mean, the last sort of thing, I don't think the PT's in such a good situation. I think obviously we've seen that Lula's played somewhat of a good role in terms of the genocide that Israel's perpetrating, but he's also been sort of like testy with regards to Venezuela. I think that is reflected a lot in the political weakness of the PT and sort of where they are. So, but no, I unfortunately haven't been following Brazil enough. I know I should be, but like
Hey,
Mexico
hey,
is
hey,
taking up a lot of
hey,
energy.
there's so much going on that you can't keep on top of everything. Actually, bonus question then that I do have to ask,
Yes.
and then we'll wrap up. Uh, Wait, what was the bonus question I wanted to ask you about? Uh, oh, come on! It was just at the tip of my head. Wait, let me think about it. Well, anyways, but no, but but I think when it comes to well, anyways, we'll have to keep on top of Brazil, and we'll have to cover that in the future. But okay, I think I completely forgot what was my bonus question, so I think we'll just wrap up there. But in the future, Jay, I definitely want to have you back on and because when you were still living in Canada, we never ever got the chance to to do a very good sort of like history episode about the Vietnam War, and you being a Marxist Leninist and having been a member of the Communist Party of Canada, I think it would be much more interesting to hear your perspective when it comes to Vietnam, North Korea, and so forth. So in the future, let's definitely do that, and I would love to do an episode where you talk to us about Argentina, the Communist Party of Argentina, and the movement there. But we're going to have
So,
to
so
save that.
the minor topic of the Cold War and Asia and Latin America. Okay. Yeah,
So we have
before
so we have to do a series of those interviews. But but until
before we go,
then,
I do wanna pop out some things that I think would be beneficial for people to check out,
go right ahead.
if that's okay. And I think if Morena has something really good, which is probably even more radical than people think about Morena, and that's the Instituto Nacional de Formación Política, the Morena. So there's a lot of good people involved in that. Alina Duarte, the cartoonist El Fisgon, other people,
Oh
lots of
wow,
Marxists, Leninists, and Marxists involved in it. They do. Recently, we were helped involved in it too as well. They did an internationalist course for people. So basically anybody who's Spanish speaking can doesn't have to be in Mexico, can participate in some of these online courses, and it's really good Marxist education about imperialism, what's happening in Mexico, things like that. So it's infpmorena.mx. If people want to look at that, or just search for Instituto Nacional de Formación de Política Morena. And then the other thing, two things I'll say is the mexicosolidarity.com is that's where I do stuff. That media website basically is you'll find the Sabrinia podcast on there. But we also translate articles from the left into English, so for people to read. So, and I do a weekly digest of like stories to keep up with. So if you want to kind of get a good overview of what's happening politically, I think it's a good place to start. And also this Sunday, Sabrina is going to be doing a live thing, which people can get involved in the Q&A and stuff with some special guests, just looking over AMLO's last 6 years. And I think it'll be a really good way. If you don't have a lot of time, you want to figure out what happened and where things are going with Morena, with Mexico, with AMLO. That would be a really good thing to look at. And you go to mexicosolidarity.com, it'll be there.
fantastic. And I'll make sure that Jay sends me the link to all that stuff in case in case I forget to put it in the show notes. And all right, well, folks, we were joined on this edition of One Plus One with Jay Watts, and let me remind folks that Jay, is a photojournalist, former central organizer of the Communist Party of Canada. Still a communist, though. Big leftist activist, historian, media NGO critic, and of course, a member of Mexico Solidarity. Jay, thank you so much for coming on the program, especially on such short notice again. And looking forward to having you back on. And all my best to you and the team in Mexico.
Thank you very much.